Good morning. It is my job to welcome you to the 65th commemoration of the 65th anniversary of the commemoration of the Tallahassee Bus Boycott. We are so honored to be hosting you here in City Hall, and we are so honored to be here to recognize the work that went into making sure that all people had access to transportation here in the city of Tallahassee via the public bus system. As you know, times are changing, but times are a whole lot better than they used to be. And we are really proud and glad about that. So we're here today to provide context, to provide information, and to celebrate the progress that we've made. I stand before you as Commissioner Diane Williams Cox, the second African-American female to be elected to the City Commission in our almost 200-year history. I also stand here as I look out into the audience and I see our director of our public bus system, Star Metro, who is a Black female. Now, we've come a mighty, mighty long ways, and I want to just thank Angela Baldwin for the work that you're doing with your staff and with the transportation system. We're operating and we're moving people around our city, and we're growing. We're working on creating a super stop on the south side of town to move more and more people from around our city and from the south side of around town. So we are making great progress. And this could not have been possible without the work of our civil rights leaders of the time, and Reverend C.K. Steele and others who met and strategized and made this happen, created a legacy that continues to today. So I am just proud to be able to stand here and welcome you to this commemoration, to this celebration. And we can never forget the sacrifices that were made for us to be here today. So as we continue in our program, I want you to just kind of reflect and remember that this work must continue. We cannot get lax and think that we've arrived. We're still on the bus. Fortunately, we can sit anywhere we want to sit on this bus. You can sit up front, you can sit in the middle, you can sit in the back. You can drive it if you're qualified. So we welcome you to City Hall, and we welcome you to your City Hall, and we thank you. Have a great morning.
Good morning. My name is Shauna Smith, and I'm honored to have been asked to share with you a little bit about the purpose of why we're doing this today. And as I was putting my thoughts together, and I was telling people I was going to be speaking at this, and several kind of comments would come to me. Why are we doing this, Shauna? You know, that's in the past. You know, why do we even need to be honoring this stuff? Who wants to bring up negative history? Why do we want to be reminded, you know, Shauna, things are getting better. You know, let's not dredge up the past. Let's not, you know, let's just leave things away. It's just not time. But then I say to them, we're here today on this actual day, 65 years later, because of two young women who didn't want to get off the bus here in Tallahassee and were then in turn written up for trying to incite a riot. And well, that was 65 years ago. Why? Why do we care? Why? The two African-American females from FAMU. But their efforts sparked the whole civil rights movement here in Tallahassee. And I'm not going to even start naming names and groups of people that came and rallied behind them, because I will omit somebody and I don't want to. But you know who you are, and we know the hearts of those who came and rallied, the professors, the civic leaders, the religious leaders, the community leaders who came and rallied behind them and sparked. But I also say to them, the bus boycott here in Tallahassee was unique. Well, there were bus boycotts in Montgomery. There were bus boycotts here. But the one in Tallahassee was unique in that it was primarily led and initiated by whom? The students. Students leaving home to just come and go get a college education, and here you're out on the streets, sitting down in sidewalks and protesting and holding up signs and risking getting arrested. And that sort of makes the extra uniqueness of the bus boycott here. Yes, there were boycotts in other cities, but they were primarily led by community leaders, Calden King and other national leaders. So why keep it up? It's 65 years ago. Where's my cue person? This is one of the reasons to still keep it up. This is the 1-year anniversary this month of George Floyd calling out for his mama with a knee on his neck, saying, "I can't breathe." Subsequently being murdered by the police, but then refueling and resparking the Black Lives Movement, done primarily by whom? Even to this day, primarily young people and students. Okay, but that was a year ago today. Why? Why keep bringing this stuff up? Because just several days ago here in Tallahassee, take a minute. If you haven't seen it, on the first year, if I'm correct, Mayor, and I'm not sure if I am correct, this is the first year that county government and city felt it important enough to stop operations to honor Emancipation Day. So on the city building, this sign was posted letting them know that the offices were closed, and someone took the liberty to write that across that poster. So why? Why? That was just about 4 days ago, right here in Tallahassee. But things are getting better in Tallahassee. You know, we've got a diverse group of civic leaders. We've got a diverse group of civic leaders. Southside Festival. We just had several days, which was probably Southside Festival of several days, which was probably one of the most beautiful events put on, an inaugural. Really? So we're here today to honor the past and embrace the future. There will be a film showing. We will also have a panel discussion. And what is our charge? Why do we do this? We do it because we hope that it will spark something in you to think, oh, well, nothing can change, nothing can be different. But hopefully spark something in you that, like Michael Jackson said, what? Be that man or that person in the mirror and look at yourself and see how in some way you can help make a change. So we're glad to have those of you here in live. We're glad to have those of you out there in the virtual world. And yes, we do need to continue. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of this production. We'll next have the greetings by our dynamic mayor.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be with each and every one of you today. It is great to be with the Steele family and with the Smith family. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Daly. I am the proud mayor of the great city of Tallahassee. 65 years ago, 2 female students from Florida A&M University showed true leadership, true courage in the face of adversity. Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson changed the course of Tallahassee history. But let's also note that on a much bigger scale, they truly started a movement that not only impacted our community, but changed the course of history for our nation. This is a day that we come together to observe and to celebrate, to remember that while many parts of our past are dark, when we come together and work together, we will create a much brighter future. It is an honor and a privilege to join my colleagues, to join my friends, and to join our community, both virtually and in person, in observance today. I would now like to invite my good friend and colleague, City Commissioner Curtis Richardson, for remarks, to be followed by my good friend, City Commissioner, Mayor Pro Tem Jeremy Matlow.
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor, for the introduction, and it is an honor to be here. I am City Commissioner Curtis Richardson, the Dean of the City Commission, as they have dubbed me. It is an absolute honor to be here this morning as we commemorate the 65th anniversary of the Tallahassee Bus Boycott. And I certainly want to recognize the Steele family that's in the audience this morning, Reverend Derek Steele and his older brother, Reverend Marion Steele. I have known them for years, and we have gotten to be good friends since I came to Tallahassee in 1974 and watched the changes that were occurring in this community during the time. And we are moving forward together, as our motto for this year's ceremony suggests. But there is still lots of work to do. The mayor mentioned the two students from Florida A&M University, Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson, who had the courage and fortitude to say, I'm not sitting in the back of the bus anymore, and were willing to go to jail for their convictions, that things had to change in this community, that Negroes, as we were called at the time, were not second-class citizens, that we deserve first-class treatment and deserve to sit on the front of the bus. And so they started the Tallahassee Bus Boycott, which was a seminal moment in Tallahassee history, the history of the state of Florida, and indeed the nation, because it then got Reverend Steele involved, who at the time was the pastor of the Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. And he brought together other civic leaders and worked with the students from Florida A&M University to bring about the bus boycott, which brought the economic system of the city of Tallahassee to its knees, because that was the way that most workers then got around the city. And without the bus system being able to operate effectively, it literally brought the economic system of our city to its knees and brought about concessions to those who were seeking better treatment during that time. But it was much larger than a bus boycott. It was the beginning of the change of society as we knew it then in the city of Tallahassee. I grew up in a small country town here in Florida called Green Cove Springs, and it was segregated during the time that I grew up. We went to attended segregated schools. There was a railroad track that separated the white community from the black community. And I remember vividly that if we were not across those railroad tracks by the time it got dark, we had rocks thrown at us and dogs sicked on us. I remember that as a child. And so the bus boycott here in Tallahassee, where similar types of events were occurring, started the change that we all wanted to see in society throughout the city of Tallahassee, in the state of Florida, and indeed throughout this nation. We've made a lot of progress, but we've got a long ways to go. And there are those in this country, even today, that are hell-bent on reversing many of the gains that have been made by African Americans and other minorities in terms of voting and healthcare and our social services system. And so it's incumbent upon us now who have come along and taken that baton to ensure that those gains that have been made are not reversed, and that our children and our children's children and generations to come no longer have to suffer the kinds of indignities that African Americans suffered in this country during those early years. And so that's what this is all about, Shauna, remembering and making sure that the history that we have experienced is not repeated in generations to come. So thank you all for being here this morning. I want to thank all who have been a part of making this happen, and I look forward to continuing to be a part of efforts like this, Dr. Parker, to make sure that we acknowledge our history, but certainly look forward to the future and move forward together. Thank you all so very much.
Good morning. I'm Mayor Pro Tem Jeremy Matlow with the City of Tallahassee. First off, I just want to thank Commissioner Williams-Cox for always keeping history on the forefront of our mind and making sure the City of Tallahassee is doing what it should do to remember. Thank you, Commissioner Richardson, for sharing your personal story, and Mr. Mayor for the opening remarks. 65 years was not very long ago. It seems like a long time ago to many, but when we really think about it, a lot has changed in 65 years, but we still have so much further to go. When we think about the bus boycotts, Ms. Jackson Patterson, and the entire spontaneity of the movement to launch this bus boycott, at that time, it was not a popular thing to do. They probably could never imagine that City Hall chambers would be recognizing them for their heroic actions 65 years ago. So I think we should recognize we have made some progress and that we can come to the city chambers in the city of Tallahassee and say, we made steps in the right direction. And I want to thank the families of Dr. Charles U. Smith and Reverend Steele for being with us today. We appreciate the sacrifice and the heroism of your families to really push this needle. And I do want to recognize that when we look at the past, we need to address the present and the future. I know a lot of people will say, well, we've had a black president. We moved on. We're done. And as we see the movements happening right now across the country, from the disparate treatment of black and brown individuals and law enforcement, a lot of them are taking positions that may not be popular in some circles. They're saying things need to change and pushing back against what the norm is now. And I think 20 years, 40 years, 65 years from now, people who may not get the recognition they need today, who are really standing in the void and saying, we can do better as a community, we can do better as a society. And I think that's what those young women did on the bus that day. That's why the hope that they instilled in the whole community to rally behind them and push and demand better. And to Commissioner Richardson's point, the economic impact when people stand together for a common cause is huge, and the power of the people is real. And when people stand together to push for better, it is achievable. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today in City Hall as we remember these brave individuals and we continue the discussion of improving the future. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Keith Parker, Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. Following the wonderful welcome by Commissioner Cox-Williams and the mayor and commission members, we now have the honor and privilege of listening to commentaries by President Robinson of Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University and Thrasher of Florida State University.
Thank you to the Planning Committee of the 65th anniversary of the Tallahassee Bus Boycott and Dr. Charles U. Smith panel discussions for this opportunity to lend my voice of support today. I'm honored to be with you and remember this day and this event that is so significant because it was two female students from Florida A&M University, Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson, who decided to sit down in the whites-only section of a segregated bus in the city of Tallahassee. I can only imagine that day they said, enough is enough. Or, as the late civil rights icon Fannie Lou Hamer so eloquently stated, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. Without question, it is appropriate that we gather to celebrate and recommit ourselves to never forgetting the ungodly and inhumane acts of Jim Crow laws that occurred across this land. When Jakes and Patterson refused to move to the colored section at the rear of the bus, the driver pulled into a service station and called the police, who arrested and charged them with placing themselves in a position to incite a riot. FAMU students, led by Colonel Brodus Hartley Jr., organized a campus-wide boycott of city buses. Their collective stand against segregation set an example that propelled like-minded Tallahassee citizens into action. Through their courageous, nonviolent protest, boycotters achieved an important victory and proved in this city that a commitment to nonviolence could achieve significant results towards equality. Former FAMU Dean and Professor Dr. Charles U. Smith chronicled these events in his book, The Civil Rights Movement in Florida and the United States, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives, and during his lifetime fought to annually commemorate the impact of this movement. As we look back, we cannot and must not forget the millions of lives lost during the Middle Passage, slavery during the Jim Crow era, and indeed the Civil Rights Movement, for us to celebrate what they did and they accomplished. Think about how they felt, what they dreamed and hoped for, even in knowing, as in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. Many would not live to see this day, and so we must remember and recognize their commitment, dedication, and most importantly, their sacrifice for us. For a moment, just imagine with me the joy they must feel, the smiles, tears, and songs of praise being sung as they look down and know that the Vice President of the United States of America is a woman of color, and that we had a two-term African-American president in the United States of America. Can you picture that? We recently celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation, which paved the way for the permanent abolition of slavery in the United States of America. We have witnessed the struggles against injustice still plaguing our land, but I stand here with you today proud that FAMU has once again been in the forefront of social and racial justice. As we did 65 years ago during the Tallahassee Bus Boycott, we once again have offered leadership at the highest levels, in which Atlanta and St. Paul, Minnesota mayors, Keisha Lance Bottoms and Melvin Carter have stepped up and stood out in leading their respective cities. We are not there yet, but I am proud to reside in a community that shows this degree of caring and empathy and has decided that we won't forget the bridge that brought us here. We live in an imperfect place, but I feel comfortable in saying that we live in a very special place. Finally, this Fannie Lou Hamer quote is not quite as recognized, but she also said, righteousness exalts a nation, hate just makes people miserable. By now, we should be sick and tired of being miserable and should do everything in our power to work towards righteousness. From the highest of 7 hills, we join you today in honoring the past and embracing the future. Thank you.
Hello, I'm President John Thrasher. I'm honored to take part in this commemoration on behalf of Florida State University. It's always an honor to reflect on the anniversary of a monumental occasion in our history. So we're here to celebrate the contributions our community has made to the civil rights movement. Through nonviolent protest, Tallahassee served as a beacon of hope for so many. We hear a lot about our great civil rights leaders, but it's also important to remember people like our FAMU, FSU students who stood up for freedom, justice, and equality during the 1950s and 60s. They truly helped create a movement. Their actions are powerful examples of how small acts of heroism by everyday people can help transform the world we live in. As we mark the 65th anniversary of the Tallahassee Bus Boycott, I believe this legacy lives on in our community at FSU, FAMU, and TCC. We value diversity and we celebrate different cultures and ethnicities. We appreciate that different points of view are the key to living, learning, and working in a dynamic environment. Let this day serve as an important reminder that it's up to each of us to embody these values and remain vigilant in promoting them. Thank you.
If I may just take a moment of privilege before we have this beautiful rendition from one of our own here in Tallahassee, I'd like to add that we talk about Carrie Patterson and Wilhelmina Jakes, but I think it's important to note that even though they did what they did, they were seen by the university profession as agitators. Don't help them. Don't go support them. So, you know, that thought just occurred to me. We're revering and we're celebrating them today. But I want to let you know that they were seen as trouble causers, agitators. Oftentimes, the university staff and faculty were discouraged from even going out and getting involved, so much so that their jobs were potentially threatened if they got out and actively got engaged. But fortunately, many of them did take that risk. And they were out there trying to get bail money and food and working with the cab system that we in the Black community had created because we were going to make sure we got to our jobs and help support each other. But that thought about those two young ladies being agitators, the thought about John Lewis and what does he say? Get in some what? Good trouble. And as I talked about earlier, when you look at that man in the mirror, yourself, sometimes it takes that step to step outside of your comfort zone to make a difference. Just wanted to share that. Thank you for that moment of privilege. Okay, so now I turn our attention over to this awesome young man, Mr. Samuel Scriven, who is a Leon High senior now, and he is very active in the theater, high school and community theater here. He's currently going to be in Anastasia, which is going to be put on by Leon High School, as well as Pippin, which is going to be out of what theater company? Quincy Music Theater. So we're just really lucky. And he's going to leave us, and he's going to go all the way to New York, to Fordham, with the pre-biology major and theater, I think. So I said, well, I got the singing vet. We got the reality show coming. The singing vet. We're already going to work this. So let's welcome and thank Mr. Scrivens and his mom, who's out here for day, who kind of we were glad she was okay with having him take time off from school today. Mr. Scrivens, thank you.
From boycotts to sit-ins, we tried nonviolence. Throw us in prison, we betrayed the silence. Cuff our hands, we will use our words. We don't have a pulpit, but we will still be heard. Generations of struggle, an endless fight. We got a king on our side who will show us the light. So we march on every day and every night, because when tomorrow comes, it'll sure be bright. We must believe as we fight on, that victory and justice can be won. Oh, we sit down to take a stand because we have just one demand. Show us that you understand. We got brothers and sisters getting locked up in jail, fighting for better days and they can't make bail, willing to get locked up so that we can be free, because it's the vision that them and Dr. King all see, that we work together, pray together, struggle together, go to jail together so that we can be free together. Doesn't matter if it's tomorrow or forever, we will find our pen and we will write our letter. Come on. we must believe as we fight on that victory and justice can be won. We sit down to take a stand because we have just one demand. I'm gonna speak my mind for a second. The world is immersed in a global pandemic. I'm not talking about a virus, it's a little more systemic. History has shown us all the battles we fought. We march, we sing, we dance, and we boycott when we have to fight for our human rights, when we're afraid to walk the streets at night, when we're scared of getting pulled over because we're not white. How will we expect it to just be all right? I'm tired of embracing all these dreams, hypotheticals, people saying quiet, embrace the parentheticals. Equality for all cannot be theoretical, so we can marching on when they tell us to let it go. That's the price we pay, fighting for justice. Some days it's a crowd, other days it is just us, but we keep moving forward, do what we must, and all the while we will have to trust. And we must believe as we fight on that victory and justice will be won. We sit down to take a stand because we have just one demand. Oh. We sit down to take a stand because we have just one demand. Treat us like you understand.
I'd like to add that. Yes. I'd like to add that that was original. That was an original, okay? Oh my goodness, mother, goodness. That was nice. Okay, let me stop. Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you. As we get ready for our closing remarks, let me remind you that we will have a film showing and a panel discussion. The topic for the panel discussion is, let me get it clear, will be Tallahassee Bus Boycott, Lessons for Our Time. So let me welcome our closing remarks person to come on down. Thank you.
Greetings and humble salutations. I am Generva Danger, a criminal justice major and soon-to-be alum at the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. I am delighted to be a part of the 65th anniversary observance of the Tallahassee Bus Boycott and the Dr. Charles U. Smith panel discussions. On May 26, 1956, two of my family sisters and fictive mothers, Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson, took a stance so the rest of us could sit with dignity. Their actions is what made it possible for the subsequent generations of transit riders to enter the bus and freely sit wherever they preferred. Today, we honor the efforts of Wilhelmina Jakes, Carrie Patterson, students, and others for the valor and courage demonstrated during times when we did not have civil-minded leaders, such as President Robinson, President Trasher, Mayor Daley, City Commissioner Diane Cox-Williams, Sheriff Walt McNeil, and Police Chief Lawrence Revel, just to mention a few. I conclude the observance of my fictive mothers, Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson, by sharing a poem, Mother to Son, from the collected works of Langston Hughes. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I've been climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there had been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps, 'cause you find it kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. Thank you.
As we get ready to say goodbye for this portion of the program, I do want to, again, just acknowledge Samuel Scrivens for the work he did. He had less than a month to do the research and put the lyrics together. So, Samuel, all right. Also, I do want to acknowledge the presence of Junerva Danger, who did that wonderful clothing. She's with us. And finally, as it pertains to young people and students, I do want to acknowledge the FAMU students, female students who thought it proper and appropriate to be with us at this very moment. So if you three future alums of Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University will stand, and I say future, okay, and we just want to acknowledge you. Lastly, I'm going off script here. Reverend Steele, if you would like to share a nanosecond or two of encouragement with these young FAMU students and inspire them to get involved, please do so.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parker. It certainly gives me great pleasure to be here for this important commemoration. As you know, our family was very much affected. After the bus boycott here in Tallahassee, our family was never the same. So I'm happy to be here and to give encouragement to these young people. My dad often said that if it were not for the FAMU students, there probably wouldn't have been a bus boycott in Tallahassee. This was the beginning of the involvement of FAMU students, but it went on through to the sit-in, lunch counter sit-ins, which also were initiated by FAMU students. So there's a legacy, there's a history of FAMU involvement. There are a lot of people who, as someone already mentioned, lost their jobs, were threatened as staff and personnel at FAMU. So it takes a lot of courage, a lot of conviction, a lot of moral standards or morality to do this and to stand for something. It's not enough just to go to school, but once you have matriculated, you should be committed to stand up for things that are right, moral, and just in society. It's your history, it's your legacy. So I challenge you. I commend you for where you are in life at this point. But let it forever be known that FAMU students played a tremendous role in the civil rights movement in Tallahassee. I was just a teenager, just turning 13 at this time. But as soon as I could get really involved, I did. And I went to jail at the age of 16 during the sit-in movements. I was the youngest student in the country, youngest high school student to go to jail for participating in the sit-ins. My older brother and I, my older brother was arrested the same as I, but he was getting ready to graduate from high school, and therefore he did not choose to go to jail. We did, those of us who went in that first round of arrests here in Tallahassee. So I just want to salute you FAMU students and other students and all of us and commend us and celebrate with you this commemoration. Thank you.
Again, thank you all. And as we bring this to a conclusion, I'm going to ask the Honorable Mayor and members of the commission to join me up front as we acknowledge and say a very special thank you. Thank you, Angela Baldwin. Angela, will you stand, of Star Metro?
And thank you, Dr. Parker, for every year making sure that we do not forget and that we come together to commemorate. So thank you for your efforts, and thank you for bringing Dr. C.U. Smith's spirit and legacy here through his daughter, Shauna Smith. And her granddaughter is here. She brings her granddaughter to make sure that we connect these legacies and so that they shall never forget. And Brother Scriven, you must record that.
Yes.
It must be recorded, and John Legend and Common must get a copy of it. Your life might change if we get this in the right places. But nevertheless, I was moved to tears.
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you, Mom, because I know that's not possible without a praying mama. Mother to son, remember that. Mother to son, thank you.
We knew of the possible dangers. I heard the initial impact of the first, huge stones, and we had to move out of our home. Close up, move out.
We were thrown into a cell. I was frightened, but I didn't want to show it. But then the people were grabbing at us through the bars, the windows, and we had never seen anything like that before.
We were spat upon, we were pushed, we were shoved, smoke blown over us, sitting at the counters and doing the picket lines, pushed out of line, people coming by saying terrible things.
They mocked us, They threw tear gas on purpose in my sister's face, and I was kicked twice by the police in my stomach.
It was racist. Tallahassee was racist.
The civil rights movement in Tallahassee was a local struggle for Black equality, but it was also part of the larger battle for racial justice throughout the South.
It was a very courageous stance for people who knew that, for me, I think they could feel that a change was coming, that this thing was bigger than themselves.
This is the beginning. This is not the end. Because from the very beginning, whites knew this is more than just about where a Black person is going to sit on a bus. This is about changing race relations. This is about what is going to become a struggle for Black rights and equality.
There was no question about turning back or whether we should do this or not do the other. Let's just head forward toward freedom.
Welcome to Footsteps to Freedom. I'm Tina Dunbar. Did you know that Tallahassee played an important role in the civil rights movement? I'm standing off the corner where McCrory's department store was once located. It was the scene of a lunch counter demonstration in the 1960s, and it sparked many other demonstrations throughout our community. In fact, this very sidewalk holds the legacy for the heroic foot soldiers of the civil rights movement living right here in our community. Theirs is a story of sacrifice, struggle, and perseverance. It is our hope that you will watch, learn, and share their story. For this is our history, one that is deeply woven in the fabric of our community.
I think this project is the exact kind of project that Tallahassee should be doing more of. We should begin to start looking at our authentic history, getting with the people who actually know the stories. If we don't get these stories in time, we will no longer have anybody around who can authenticate the history.
It began with a lot of planning, and the city came to us with an idea, and we made it a reality. This has got to be one of the largest scope projects we've ever encountered in my time here. I think we were able to really perform and do something that is going to be long-lasting for Tallahassee and important to our culture and history here.
The footprints with all the different names is what was most impressive to me. And when I went and looked, I said, you know, there are some people in Tallahassee who are going to be so thrilled that the work of their parents, their grandparents, their ancestors has not been forgotten. And that finally all of those days of fear and marching and protesting so that life could be better for all of us will finally be recognized in a very prominent way.
Many people believed in the 1950s, before the civil rights movement began all over the South, and even continue to believe today, that Florida was not a typical Deep South state, that somehow its race relations were better, things were different here, but events proved that to be untrue.
Tallahassee was like a typical small southern town, 27,000 people when we came in '52. But it was racist. Tallahassee was racist.
For us, it was a normal environment. Many times we had to go downtown. There were 9 of us. If any of us had to go to the restroom, if we were at McCrory's watching a parade, she had to figure out a way to duck across the street so we could go to this bathroom in the bottom of the courthouse, which I later found out was the black bathroom.
If I go in a store and it's a water fountain there, why do I have to go to the ones that colored? She said, 'cause you're black. I said, I just want to get this thing straight. I went to the white one, and a white man came in there, And he said, well, what you doing over there drinking water? I said, 'cause I want to find out the difference in this water. I said, I thought y'all had some sweet water over here, and we didn't have no sweet water. They said, child, you could have been dead. I said, why I was going to be dead? I wasn't bothering anybody. I said, I just was drinking the water. She said, that's one of the reasons you'd have got killed.
Tallahassee was very much a Deep South community. 30% or closer to a third of the population was black. But the community was controlled by a tightly knit group of white businessmen, white politicians, and there was very little opportunity for blacks to step out of this rigidly segregated community. It was really a dual society. It was really a system of apartheid. Every aspect of society was segregated. Well, in May 1956, this all changed when two black women students from Florida A&M University refused to give up their seat next to a white woman and moved to the rear of the bus. Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson were both students at Florida A&M. They lived off campus, and they'd gotten on the bus to go downtown to get to Patterns to make dresses for a dance that was upcoming at the university. And they sat in one of the front row seats next to a white rider, and when they refused to move, they were arrested and taken to jail.
They told her if she didn't move to the back of the bus, her and Carrie Patterson, that the bus driver would just pull to the side of the street next to a payphone. Imagine that today. And go call the police. And my aunt said the policeman came aboard and said, you girls want a ride? I'll give you a ride.
Interestingly, the young women were charged with inciting a riot. They were not charged with violating the city's bus segregation ordinance.
Well, they were eventually released, and a cross was burned in front of their apartment. When my aunt spoke about it, she said they looked out the window and they said, there's something burning out there. It's a cross. And I can only imagine the fear they must have felt if someone would come into your boundary, your space, on the property where you're living, in the heart of what was then the African American community, and take a cross out and plant it in the yard and light it, were people who were very dangerous.
On Monday, 2 days after the young women were arrested, students at Florida A&M rallied together and decided that they would boycott the buses coming onto the campus. And so when buses were coming through the campus, they would stop and ask people to get off. So that's how the bus boycott began. It was a student-initiated boycott and the first activist protest in the civil rights movement in Tallahassee.
These students, they were willing to risk their safety. Some of them didn't even understand the danger that they were in. Many of them were involved in the movement without their parents' knowledge. Parents thought that their kids were here in class, and they were on the picket lines. It was a very courageous stance for people who knew that, for me, I think they could feel that a change was coming, that this thing was bigger than themselves.
It was a lovely day, lovely spring day in May. I was on my way home from FAMU High School, and usually we would walk, but I remember Clifford, my younger brother, and I were together. We got the bus that day, and the crowds were in the street. We had heard nothing about a boycott or anything at that point. But immediately we knew what had happened when the students were yelling, "Get off that bus." There were other people on the bus at that time. And when we got home, we learned for sure that a boycott had been called. And that's how it began.
Some buses had a line drawn about a quarter of the way down to the back of the bus. Sometimes it was across the ceiling, sometimes it was across the floor. And the blacks were supposed to always go beyond that line. The bus driver, if there were black people in seats up closer to the front, he would tell them they got to get up and move to the back and let this white person, might be a kid, 10 years old, and let this kid sit down. And it was very humiliating, it really was.
And what was the most upsetting to blacks is when they boarded the bus in the predominantly black routes, they would often have to stand even though there was only one white person sitting in the 3-person seat or the 2-person seat at the front of the bus. There was a mass meeting and the black community voted to support the bus boycott. And one important thing that came out of that meeting was that they created a new organization, the Inter-Civic Council, the ICC, to lead the boycott. It was mainly comprised of black ministers and local black businessmen who were not dependent on the city or state government for their employment. And C.K. Steele quickly became the leader of the boycott, and he was recognized as the leader of the boycott in the black and in the white community.
Reverend Steele was a man who fought for the poor people. He fought for all the rights that we needed to have.
I am the second son of Reverend and Mrs. C.K. Steele Sr. There were 6 of us. Life was, I suppose, rather typical of an African-American pastor's family in the South. And of course, after the bus boycott started, life changed altogether. We lived in some fear, but determined. We were determined, and you might say courageous. My dad was very courageous. Nobody had any doubts or uncertainties about whether we should be involved in this or my dad should be involved in it.
From the very beginning, whites thought that the NAACP was the backbone behind the ICC and the bus boycott. And although the NAACP did make one of the first contributions to the boycott, it was the Inter-Civic Council, which was an independent group, that led the boycott. One of the most important things that the black community did in that first mass meeting at Bethel Baptist Church was to form a carpool so that when blacks boycotted the buses, they would have a way to get to work. The boycott very quickly got the attention of whites because blacks were 80% of bus patrons. So if you have a bus boycott that is supported by the vast majority of the black community, the bus company is going to start to feel some economic pain when nobody is riding the bus. Less than 2 months after the bus boycott started, the bus company had to shut down the transportation system because the revenue had dropped so much they could not afford to keep the buses running. So when this happened, there was a real increase in intimidation toward blacks in the community, not just the drivers in the bus boycott, but to the leaders of the bus boycott.
We had to move out of our home. I mean, close up, move out. We were right there on the corner of Tennessee and Boulevard. At that time, it's Martin Luther King Boulevard now. We had to move out of the house because of attacks, late night attacks. The first one was loud hecklers coming by in cars, stopping and throwing bricks and stones through all the windows across the front of the house. I heard the initial impact of the first, huge stones and rocks coming through the house. First sound, I was up out of the bed and under the bed before I knew it. And then my mother was quickly gathering everybody together and getting us in the center of the house. My dad remained up front in his bedroom and actually looking out at the guys throwing the bricks, and the cross burning had that happen, and also gunshots. You know, this wasn't just one incident, and it continued, so we felt it wasn't safe. Well, it wasn't safe for us to be there.
In the fall of 1956, the Ku Klux Klan came to Tallahassee, and in full hooded menace, they paraded past Steele's parsonage. And blacks, instead of cowering in their home, had a huge prayer meeting and continued to support their leaders and continued to support the bus boycott. Many blacks who supported the bus boycott, cars were shot, insurance policies were canceled, people were threatened at work, but still the bus boycott continued.
When I think about that time in the late 50s when my aunt, along with Carrie Patterson, decided that they would go to jail rather than move to the back of the bus. Those days were not days to be taken lightly, because that was taking your life in your hands. And that was risking your life. And I'll never forget my mother telling me years later, she said, well, my mother got a call from someone saying, we're going to kill you. And that's something we never dream of. Someone calling our phone and saying, we're going to kill you, okay? Or we're going to kill her.
And you have to remember that while all this is going on in Tallahassee, the Montgomery bus boycott is still going on in Montgomery, Alabama. But when the Tallahassee bus boycott started in May 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott was only 5 months old. And there was absolutely no indication that the Montgomery bus boycott would succeed. Well, the city commission and other powerful whites were so intent on maintaining segregation on the buses that even after the federal court ruled that Montgomery's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional, and this was in June of 1956, the city commission refused to say that that applied to Tallahassee. And so the bus boycott continued. Finally, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery, Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional, and that all of Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. C.K. Steele and a team of ministers got together, and they boarded the buses, and they sat toward the front of the bus, and they rode around town. A couple of the ministers were asked to move, and they didn't, and nothing happened. Well, the next day, the city arrested the head of the City Transit Bus Company for not enforcing the bus segregation ordinance. So you see that blacks had caused this division, had driven this wedge in the white community between the city government that was more intent on maintaining segregation at any cost, and between the bus company who was more concerned with not going out of business. So the ICC, the black community, decided, well, we're gonna have a big ride. We're gonna ask all blacks to come out and ride the bus. Well, when they got to the designated bus stops, large crowds, over 200 people of whites came out with bats, with bricks, with everything to try to keep the blacks from boarding the bus. So C.K. Steele called off that mass riding the buses and said, we're just gonna continue on individual basis to ride the bus.
There was a crowd of people there. There was a good 35 or 40 people there at the bus stop. I said, we have a good crowd, saying this to myself. But nobody got on the bus except me. When I got on the bus, I sat behind the driver, and the driver said, you're gonna have to move to the back of the bus. I didn't argue with him, but I didn't say anything at all. In a few minutes, a photographer came up and snapped a picture. I didn't think that was so unusual. So the bus driver, I guess he was puzzled, very puzzled. So rather than him driving on off, he decided to reach up and turn the engine off. And we just sat there for about I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes, I don't know exactly how long. What was going on, I did not know, because Reverend Steele and his other assistants had gotten death threats. If they would do that the next morning, that same morning, there'd be some lives killed. And they called it off. I did not get the word that they had called it off. So I'm the one that went and got on the bus.
The violence against the bus boycotters became so intense that Governor Leroy Collins temporarily suspended bus service in January 1957. The buses had resumed operation in the summer of 1956 with reduced routes and fares to encourage whites to come back to the bus.
Tallahassee still didn't have the kind of violence that other places such as Birmingham, Montgomery, Little Rock had. We had plenty.
After the United States Supreme Court in December had said that Alabama's bus segregation laws were illegal, the city rescinded the original segregation ordinance and decided to enact a new ordinance that would require that the bus drivers would seat bus patrons where they wanted. So if you got on the bus, you bought your ticket and you were told to sit in seat 6 or seat 4. And they said it was because of the health and safety of the patrons, but really everybody knew it was just to try and maintain segregation. So by the spring of 1957, the whole city was just weary of this year-long bus boycott and what it had cost the city. And so without officially striking down their latest ordinance, they just quit enforcing that. And so blacks came back to the buses and rode in an integrated fashion. The boycotters, the ICC, could point to a victory because they had achieved their demands. Segregation was no longer tolerated on the buses. Black bus drivers had been hired, and more importantly, the boycotters had forced powerful and important whites to make concessions to their demands. So this was one battle that was won, but for the black community, it gave people hope and encouragement. And to the white community, it showed this is the beginning, this is not the end. Because from the very beginning, whites knew this is more than just about where a black person is gonna sit on a bus. This is more than just if someone can sit in the front row and doesn't have to stand in the back or give up their seat to a white person. This is about changing race relations. This is about what is going to become a struggle for black rights and equality.
It was the second successful boycott of any in the country. In fact, it said, I heard my dad say Tallahassee was more successful in its boycott than Montgomery was.
Just like Rosa Parks, she just got tired of doing what she had been doing, and that gave other people a little encouragement. Just let them know that you put your money in, you expect to ride the bus like everybody else and get the same accommodation.
Blacks had used the bus boycott to begin to plant the seeds for a more multifaceted civil rights movement that eventually would change race relations in this community.
Well, the City of Tallahassee and Leon County, along with many citizens, recognized the need to memorialize the civil rights movement in Tallahassee. The site at the corner of Monroe Street and Jefferson Street offered that opportunity because that's where the McCrory's Dime Store was. And McCrory's Dime Store was the site of protests against the segregated seating policy of the time. And making the sidewalk itself the memorial gave us an opportunity to let people walk where history was made, and to do this entirely within the public realm where the demonstrations actually happened. Well, I just drew it and drew it and drew it. I love to draw, so I just did a lot of sketches. We presented the idea, the concept, to the City Commission, and the City Commission was enthusiastic about it, and we began work with FSU Master Craftsman Studio.
Master Craftsman Studio is a production studio. We make a lot of different objects for the university. The way the project started is the city gave us the initial design, and then we sort of massaged the design. This is a computer-generated plan that gives us a picture of what the final project will look like once it's installed downtown Tallahassee. And on each of these brass footprints are men and women's names who were prominent in the local civil rights movement.
This isn't something we've done before, so we did a lot of research. This is the 2D layout for water jet cutting. This is the vector files for the lines that the machine will be following with the letters, the phrases included. So the way we cut the brass is put the sheet into the machine, and we zero the machine to the corner of the brass. From there, it will read the OMAX program, and it will follow the lines that we have designated for it. The machine engages once I push play, and with the high pressure water and the garnet abrasive, it's able to cut through the brass sheet almost like butter.
So we use that program and cut our pattern for each of the feet, and perfect letters. Then we'll be mixing up some aggregate and cement and putting it in the bucket here, add some water, some pigment, and we'll put it in the casting box for casting all the different sections. And we'll just begin by putting some into the box and building up about a 3/8 inch layer. We will have backed this with 3 inches of concrete and put rebar and reinforcing lath through it. Once this is cured, then we can take it outside and flip the entire works over to expose the face of the concrete.
We begin polishing. We've got what is called a termite, and it is an 8-disc oscillating polisher. And with a little bit of water, they will glide right over the surface and flatten out the stone for us and reveal that aggregate. And then we grout. And grout just fills in all the little holes, air bubbles we might have had while casting. And then after grout, we seal it, which gives it the ultimate shine at the end and the protection and slip guard that's needed for a sidewalk. So it's taken just about 4 months by the time we're done. The city came to us with an idea, and we made it a reality. And I think we've come up with something pretty spectacular.
When I first saw the finished product going into place, that was one of the most exciting events of my life, honestly. To see those panels being placed into the sidewalks so carefully and so beautifully by the Public Works Department. It was a beautiful August day, very hot, but that was just magic. It's the kind of thing that an architect lives for. I'm very proud of the sidewalk, and every time I drive by it or walk by, I'm delighted to see somebody pointing at it or taking a picture or just pausing to read. That's the best part. That's the part which will last.
The civil rights movement was not just one protest that led to one demonstration that led to another demonstration to another protest. It was not this linear movement that you can just chart out. After the bus boycott ended in 1957, there was no large demonstration or civil rights activity until 1960. But in 1959, things really changed when Patricia and Priscilla Stevens attended a CORE meeting in Miami, Florida. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, was an interracial civil rights organization. There they saw how direct action protest could take place and what the results could be.
By accident, we went to this workshop, and we were so moved that we decided that we would come back to Tallahassee and organize a CORE chapter. We had no idea what we were doing, trust me, but we just thought we could do it. My father told us, he said, anybody can do wrong, but it takes a good person to do right. He said, you don't need to do wrong. You look at other people and see what they're doing. You don't need to do the same thing. You do right. And that has stayed with us all our lives.
I think my involvement came from two things. One is my father's idea that if you stand up for something that's right, stand up and don't give ground. But from my mother, it was more important. It was like fairness for all people.
So when Patricia and Priscilla came back to FAMU in the fall of 1959 and started the first CORE chapter, it was a very significant moment for the Tallahassee civil rights movement.
The strategy of CORE was to test. Although we knew Tallahassee was segregated, but you just could not assume. You had to actually test it out.
In February of 1960, Pat Stevens and her sister Priscilla and other FAMU students went downtown Tallahassee and sat in at the Woolworth lunch counter.
We had already made our plans, what we were going to do. We were going to go in, sit to the counter, order what we wanted, and not leave when asked to.
And they said, you must leave. And I said to them, we would not leave until we were served.
We decided that we were going to jail, if necessary.
They were immediately arrested and taken to jail.
That first experience was a first one of having gotten arrested for just trying to get a little lunch. It was a matter of displaying some courage, demanding to be served, being unafraid of what might have happened to us.
It was an exhilarating experience. They had actually done an overt action against segregation. I mean, walking into a Woolworths or a McCroy's and sitting down at a lunch counter and demanding service was very important. This wasn't a publicly owned facility. This was a private owned company. To go in and sit down at a seat and say, I want you to serve me and I'm going to stay here until I'm served. This is something far different than a boycott where people just withdraw their service. This is actively coming in, sitting down, and demanding service. So the demonstrations continued. The FAMU students organized another lunch counter demonstration.
And we built up a group of people too, because when students heard about what we were doing, we may have started out with 8 people. Then we could get like 10 or maybe 15.
Students that went to McCroy's to sit in and students that went to Woolworths to sit in were arrested. So Pat Stevens organized 1,000 students or more to go back into town and demand that the students be released from jail. Well, meanwhile, the city commission ordered the police to stop the demonstrators from coming into town. Whites were swarming in the middle of all this with tear gas flowing, hitting blacks, knocking down blacks.
We were spat upon, we were pushed, we were shoved, smoke blown over us, sitting at the counters And during the picket lines, pushed out of line, people coming by saying terrible things.
Persons who were standing by, who harassed us. There was a struggle at this particular occasion. Got my eyeglasses broken.
They mocked us, you know. They threw tear gas on purpose in my sister's face.
And it burned Pat's eyes so badly that for the rest of her life, she had to wear dark glasses.
And I was kicked twice by the police in my stomach.
Students were arrested and taken to jail, both black and white students.
My brother's name was William H. Larkins, and he was a student at Florida A&M University. He decided, I'm not going to just go and buy something at a separate register and go out and eat it. I want to sit there with them. We're paying the same money, so I want to sit down and I want to eat at the lunch counter, and that's what he did. He spent 49 days in jail, and he refused bail because he felt that, you know, he was going to stay there until something happened.
The sit-ins really took the city of Tallahassee and Tallahasseans by surprise because it was the first time that blacks in the community had used this new concept of nonviolent direct action protest.
My father, as well as many others, would not have been involved if there had not been the importance of nonviolence.
In fact, two of C.K. Steele's sons were arrested at one of the lunch counter demonstrations.
I was the first high school teenager to go to jail. My brother and I were the first high school teenagers to be arrested. And to tell you the truth, it was a memorable experience, not because of how bad it was, but I was young and I knew it was right. I knew it was important. I didn't know exactly where it was going, but I had the feeling that it was going in the right direction and that we would be triumphant. So at 16, I worked on the chain gang out of Leon County Jail.
This was an epic battle to change society, and there were huge ramifications. Students could be suspended from school, and some were. Students could lose their scholarships, and some did. People went to jail. They stayed in jail. They had to pay fines. So for many Florida A&M students who were the first generation in their family to go to college, they were threatened with losing all of that, all their parents had worked for. But these students were different. They had been raised at a time when aspirations for blacks were increasing. They had been taught in school, these are the tenets that our country was based on. Equality of man, the rights of all people. And if you work hard in this country, you can get what you want. And they can't go in a lunch counter and sit down at the counter and order a hamburger. They're supposed to go to the back of the store with the black takeout. Well, of course, this was intolerable. But Tallahassee really was put on the map, so to speak, when the students were convicted and sentenced to jail. What happened next was the first time this had ever happened anywhere in the South. Of the 11 demonstrators that were arrested that day, 8 of them decided that they would go to jail rather than pay their fine against what they thought was an unjust law.
Paying bail, we felt, would be paying for segregation or paying to help the others, so we just stayed.
This was amazing news, not just in Tallahassee, but in the South. These students are going to stay in jail. They're going to go to a jail in the Deep South, and who knows what's going to happen.
We were thrown into a cell that had 4 bunk beds, top and bottom, but the door to the cell could not be locked. And the inmates frightened us. You know, we had never been around people who had committed crimes, and we knew it. And so we slept together. I was frightened, but I didn't want to show it because I was a spokesman for the group, and so I internalized.
The conditions weren't good at all. They were bad, but we were going to endure. I slept on the floor in jail on a pad, and I caught a death of cold before I got out. I got pretty sick.
Two of us slept together. One night, one person slept with the back on the wall, and the other person slept hanging over the bed, and you had to hold on, so you could never have a deep sleep. In 49 days, we never slept deeply.
CORE, of course, became involved in the students' case. They spread this all over the country. And so a lot of notoriety came to Tallahassee because of that, but more importantly, people all over the country in the North and in other parts of the South saw and heard from these students what was happening in the capital of the state of Florida. The fact that this movement held together, this sit-in movement and these demonstrations held together is really remarkable. That it did not happen all over Florida. It did not happen all over the South. There might be one demonstration or two demonstrations, and then as soon as someone was suspended from school or someone served out a jail sentence, you know, it's so understandable to see why people would not risk this. So they continued on with demonstrations and protests, but the city had made a decision that they would not arrest any more students because they didn't want to bring so much notoriety to the demonstrations. So what was the result of all this? Well, once again, the business community was more upset about what was going on than the City Commission. The City Commission, the leaders of the community wanted to maintain segregation, but the businesses were losing money. So what ultimately happened in this community was that representatives from CORE and a few whites from the community, particularly white ministers, got together and went to the managers of Woolworths and McCroy's, and the managers said, we want this to end. We're losing business. We don't want there to be this violence like we have seen in Albany and some other places across the South. You know, what can we do? So they worked out an agreement to end segregation at those lunch counters, and only those lunch counters. So by the middle of 1963, the lunch counter demonstrations, 3 years after those demonstrations started, the national chain lunch counters were integrated. But there was still segregation at locally owned stores. There was still segregation all over the community. It was going to take intervention by the federal government, most specifically in a federal law that would outlaw segregation in public and private facilities.
We had a knowledge that we would win the struggle and that the struggle would be won. And there was never any doubt that our involvement would not succeed.
Tallahassee has not really realized the important place they played in the civil rights movement.
This particular project will be here for future generations yet to come. When I am no longer around, you are no longer around, our children will not have to dig so much to uncover history.
If there had not been civil rights movements in Tallahassee, throughout Florida, and throughout the South, the Civil Rights Acts would never have passed, or they would have passed many years later. So the courage and conviction of those early black demonstrators, whether in bus boycotts or lunch counter demonstrations, theater demonstrations, those first black plaintiffs who filed in court to desegregate the public schools, all those brave people who fought for years for their basic constitutional rights, we have them to thank for those acts of legislation that finally began to ensure blacks that they would enjoy the benefits of American citizenship and protection of the Constitution. Finally, the government became an ally to blacks and not an enemy.
Amazing grace.
If I could say one thing about how we could commemorate and recognize and honor the foot soldiers, I would say as Americans, we need to learn to love each other more, to take care of each other more, to help each other more, to understand each other more, to come together more. That at least was part of what they wanted.
Forgive everybody, love everybody, no matter what. And it works out better than when you hold grudges and hate. You know, people have done a lot of evil things to me, to us. But you don't go around hating anybody. You can't carry that burden around.
I wish that people would begin to see and treat each other as best they can treat them, no matter whether black, white, or Hispanic, or whatever, because people are people. Anybody that live and breathe, they bleed when they're injured. They have the same feelings as anyone else, and people need to know that.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm a professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. And what I've been asked to do today is to get us to think about the Tallahassee bus boycott in context with the current historical moment that we're actually living through right now, and that is the global Black Lives Matter movement. And so I've been asked to kind of think about how we would situate the Tallahassee bus boycott and kind of bring it to life and think about the lessons it has for our own time. And I think this is a really important question. In fact, as a movement historian, I consider this to be really the most important question we can grapple with now. Like 1956, we are grappling with a lot of problems, a lot of social problems. Inequalities in our schools, inequalities in our criminal justice system, in labor markets, in the racial wealth gap. There are many unresolved issues, or issues that African Americans and their allies were grappling with in 1956, which are still with us today. So let me break down the Tallahassee bus boycott a little bit and talk about how I think it is relevant to our own time. And when I think about the boycott, I think first and foremost of one of the rank and file organizers of that boycott, Mrs. Laura Dixie. And several of you, or many of you probably remember that when Mrs. Dixie passed away a few years ago, the Reverend Dr. R.B. Holmes referred to her Mrs. Dixie, as the mother of the movement. And when we learn about who Laura Dixie was, I think there's a lot of important lessons for our own time. Laura Dixie was not a college graduate. She was not an upper middle class person. She wasn't incredibly highly educated, but she was the foundation of the civil rights movement in Tallahassee. She was a rank and file organizer of the bus boycott, and she would go to her neighbors, she would go to people who were thinking about riding the bus and explain to them why it was important to honor the boycott. And without her and her working class brothers and sisters, the boycott would never have been successful. And she continued to work with Reverend C.K. Steele for decades after the end of the boycott. And so some lessons in Mrs. Dixie's life is that you don't have to be incredibly affluent or highly educated to be a movement organizer or a movement activist. Another lesson, the movement is intergenerational. The Tallahassee Bus Boycott was successful insofar as young people, like I'm talking about middle school students, high school students, college students, older elders, grandparents, great-grandparents, that was what made that movement. It was intergenerational. And so when we think about the civil rights movement, we often think of young people. And that's really cool. That's very important because in many cases, it was middle school and high school students who were courageous and took risks in the movement. But the movement was also intergenerational, and that's why it succeeded, because it needed every single person in the Black community in Tallahassee, not just people at Florida A&M, not just people in the French Quarter, not just people in what's now the Gaither neighborhood. It took everyone working together to win that boycott. So how would we apply those lessons of the Tallahassee Bus Boycott to the Black Lives Matter movement today? A lot of historians believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is the largest, potentially the largest social movement in American history. At least 20 million people marched in the streets last spring and summer, and the movement now has become global. Now, the civil rights movement in the 1950s was global as well. There were important connections between what was happening in Tallahassee with the struggle against white supremacy and segregation, and what was happening in Pretoria or Johannesburg with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. People in Latin America, people in Africa, people in Europe took inspiration by what people in Tallahassee did for a full year in organizing the Tallahassee Bus Boycott. So both movements are global. So what are some of the takeaways? One is that, again, it's going to take an intergenerational movement for justice to change the problems we have in our society now, those unresolved issues. Remember that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who played such a crucial role in the Montgomery bus boycott, remember that Dr. King's final book was called Chaos or Community? Where do we go from here? Let me repeat the title, Chaos or Community? Where do we go from here? Published in 1968. Now, Dr. King didn't write a book titled, Thank God We've Overcome, right? He asked, where do we go from here? Because he knew in 1968 that the movement had not succeeded, that it had not fulfilled most of the goals that Dr. King and Reverend Steele and Lord Dixie had for the movement. And those goals included equality, social justice, the end of poverty, not just poverty reduction, but the abolition of poverty. So the three takeaways I'll leave us with this afternoon are, number one, do what you're doing right now. Continue to learn from our movement history. Talk to the elders who we still have with us who took part in the Tallahassee Bus Boycott. Learn how they had the courage, how they found the courage to stand up for their rights. Well, I'm a historian, so obviously I'm going to say that, right? But number two is fight injustice from where you are at, right? Okay, so if you're a school teacher, fight injustice where you work at, in the school system, in the educational system, right? If you work in other areas, then fight injustice where you are. Start from where you are at, where you feel comfortable. The final most important thing is find other people to organize with. This is Lord Dixie's central lesson for us today. Those of you who knew Mrs. Dixie knew that her house was a clearinghouse and a welcoming place and a meeting place for movement people. Her doors were always open. In fact, I never knew Mrs. Dixie's door, and Sam Dixie, her husband, I never knew their house to ever be locked, right? They were constantly having meetings, constantly having people over. There's a wonderful book called Democracy is an Endless Meeting, right? What that means is that the problems we face, brothers and sisters, today, in terms of the inequalities, the injustices, the continuing racism, the problems we face today are too big for one person or 5 people or even 100 people to overcome. We need organizing. We need backup. We need help. We need mutual aid, solidarity, support. Whenever we needed help in Tallahassee, whenever there was someone who was being mistreated, whenever there was a social injustice occurring, we knew we could call upon people like Mrs. Laura Dixie, Mrs. Patricia Stevens Dew, Malachi Andrews, Charles Smith, the list goes on and on and on. The takeaway there is that, again, organizing involves a lot of people. You can't fight the system alone. You need to find people who will work with you. So I've already gone on probably a bit too long, but again, when you give a microphone to a history professor, that's kind of dangerous. But again, I'm very honored to be able to spend a few minutes with you. Thank you so much for the work you're doing in commemorating the Tallahassee Bus Boycott. This is a sacred day in the history of Tallahassee and the state of Florida, and really in the United States of America. So thank you for what you're doing, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And ride the buses for free today.